Support for Disrupted comes from the Connecticut Office of Film, Television, and Digital Media.
For many students and families, navigating the world of higher education is difficult. Some of the challenges, like student loan debt, have been a persistent problem for years.
The numbers are concerning. Nearly 6 million Americans are at least 3 months behind on their federal student loan payments. That's according to research from TransUnion. And the Federal Student Aid Office warns that many delinquent borrowers are in danger of defaulting in the coming months.
Other challenges come from more recent changes.
American universities on edge, staring down federal funding cuts to the tune of billions of dollars.
The federal government says it has revoked more than 300 international student visas at campuses all across the country.
The federal judge struck down a Trump administration guidance aimed at eliminating DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion programs at schools and universities.
From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking about the challenges that students face in the world of higher education. Later in the show, we'll hear from the interim chancellor of the Connecticut State Colleges and University System. But up first, Jamal Watson. He's a journalist covering higher education. He's also Associate Dean of the School of Professional and Graduate Studies and Professor of Strategic Communication and Public Relations at Trinity Washington University. His new book is The Student Debt Crisis, America's Moral Urgency. Jamal, welcome to Disrupted.
Thanks so much, Dr. Brown-Dean. Good to be here.
I'm excited to talk to you about this book for a number of reasons. One, because of the scope and magnitude of this problem that you are talking about in this book, and also the seemingly inability of the public to really grasp the magnitude of the problem and do something about it. Before we get into the current status of student debt, I want you to walk us through the origins of how we got here. And in particular, this question that kept coming up is, has this always been at a crisis level and so big, or have things gotten worse? So how did we get to this point of the student debt crisis in the U.S.?
Well, I think we got to this point where we stopped thinking about student debt as access to college, rather, as a public good, right? And higher education as a public good. And so if we begin to think about higher education as a public good, then that means that, again, the access to opportunity, the access to higher ed means that it's benefiting society in general. And I think what happened was that we shifted the focus to begin to think about higher education as a kind of private commodity. And I think that's part of the problem. And so the burden of that then fell on individuals rather than as the collective. And so you think about the historic gains, and I mentioned this in the book, where you had the passage of the Higher Education Act, right? When you had the passage of all of these opportunities, whether that was the Pell Grant that really provided opportunities for low-income people to be able to access college, a GI Bill and all of that. Now, I think what has happened is that we have not kept pace with the rising costs of a college education. And as a result, I think it has become a major problem in our society.
There's often, Jamal, it feels like a moral indictment of people who raise this issue for the very reason that you're saying, that we no longer think of access to education as a public good, one that we should invest in. When I hear people talk about, well, it wasn't too long ago that community college was completely free, or that even some public state universities and college experiences had free programs, now it is, well, if you really care about your education, you should just be able to plan for that and afford it. But the subtitle of your book makes it plain why this is something we all should care about. That subtitle is America's Moral Urgency. And I want to lift this passage from your book for our listeners. You write that student debt has become one of the country's most pressing civil rights issues of our day. And yet, Jamal, many people don't talk about it as a civil rights issue. What makes student debt a civil rights issue?
So I think the way in which it's been framed is really we really have to frame it correctly. If we think about the ways in which Black women in particular bear so much of that debt, and I talk about that in the book. And so I like to think about it as both a civil rights and a moral issue, as you pointed out, because if we are not training the next generation of teachers to go into our urban schools and our rural schools, if we are not training the next generation of nurses, right, to go into places where they are desperately needed because many of these individuals are concerned that they're not going to be able to make enough money to be able to pay back their debt, then we have a moral crisis on our hands, right? How can we be competitive in the global on the global stage if we're not actually producing individuals to be able to meet the challenge and the need that exists? So I think we have to think about it in moral terms, but we also have to think about it in the civil rights tradition that I come out of, which is to think about the ways in which the community rallies against injustice, right? And that certainly was the case in the 1950s and 60s. It's no coincidence that you had folks like Adam Clayton Powell or others pushing for access to opportunity and education as well. And so, again, to me, there's this kind of correlation between thinking about this as a moral issue, but also a civil rights. Dr. King was killed in Memphis organizing on behalf of the garbage workers, those sanitation workers. His last campaign was one around economics. And so if we can't make the kind of connection and parallels between the economics that exist, between pricing out students from being able to achieve opportunities when we've told them that you have to do everything possible in order to get to college, and then they get to college and realize that they can't afford it, then I think this is an indictment on our larger society.
You are very intentional in this book about talking about the entire scope and span of higher education opportunities. You are not just talking about elite private institutions. You are talking about technical and vocational programs, community colleges, other ways that young people, and not just young people, but people in general, can pursue a better path. And I think it's important, Jamal, because again, people have this image of who it is going to college or seeking some kind of postgraduate opportunity. And it's also important because you talk about these challenges don't stop once a person goes to pursue their education. You talk about the prevalence of housing and food insecurity amongst college students. Talk to us more about that challenge.
Yeah, so as I was touring the country, really doing interviews for this book, and even now, I was encountering these students who were basically sleeping on the couches of their friends, right? Because they didn't have a place to live, or they were accessing food pantries to be able to get a meal. This is what I call the the invisibility of this crisis, right? Even before the loan repayments began, students were struggling with these kind of basic insecurities around housing and food. And that, of course, we know impacts mental health as well, right? Because if you're struggling and you're trying to deal with all of these challenges, I think it's very, very difficult for you to maintain some order in your life when chaos is surrounding you. And so I try to capture that. And what I found was that, again, many college presidents told me that they were setting up more emergency student funds during the pandemic. And particularly, this was a major issue because, of course, many students were then sent from campus back to their hometowns. They had no access to internet. So again, we talk, about pivoting to online instruction, but if you're living in a rural area in Louisiana and you don't have broadband access, which again, most people don't think about, you can't necessarily do your class. And so Harry Williams from the Thurgood Marshall College Fund had told me that many of his member institutions were actually doing correspondence courses, right? Where they were sending students their work by mail, U.S. postal mail, and they had to return it. And so again, we often don't think about that population, but there are many, many students who are struggling economically. And that's even before they have to pay back these loans after graduation.
You and I have the privilege and the honor of working with college students every day,
Yeah.
of being able to understand and see firsthand the ways that access to education can transform the lives, not just of those students, but of entire families, neighborhoods, and communities. And yet, Jamal, we also are able to witness how those small, seemingly mundane decisions that we can make as educators can have an impact on that path. One of the things that instantly comes to mind is about textbooks and how the textbooks, the materials that we choose can often be the difference for a student. I remember my experience as a high school student taking a college math course. That textbook was $150, which for my working class family was, do we pay a bill or do we get this textbook?
Yeah.
And it was my teacher, Mr. Robert Bowe, shout out to Mr. Bowe, who said, this is ridiculous. This is going to be a barrier. What are those other kinds of ways that maybe for people not in higher ed that they don't realize compounds the situation for students, that in your journeys, in your interviews, your work as a journalist, as an educator, that stand out to you as things we should be talking more about?
Yeah, so I'm encouraged to see more and more colleges and universities using open educational resources, right? I think that's really important to really provide students the opportunity to access the readings and the materials, but to do it in a way that's not costly. That's the first thing. I think there's also other ways in which we can share material as well. And so, again, there's so many, the internet and technology has opened doors for those of us who are educators to be able to share information that goes beyond textbooks as well. And I think that's really important. Um, when I graduated high school, I went to a church in Camden, New Jersey. It was right over the bridge from Philadelphia, where I grew up. It was First Nazarene Baptist Church. And I remember the Sunday before I went off to college, my congregation passed the plate, right? And then they passed the plate some more. And then they took all of the money and they put it in a trash bag. They didn't even take it to the back and count it. They put it in a trash bag and they said, congratulations, good luck. I was on my way to Georgetown University and they gave me the trash bag full of cash. Well, when I got home, I counted the funds with my parents and it was over $6,000. Right? It was over. So these were working class people, similar to those individuals that you mentioned. They worked at Campbell Soup Factory. They drove SEPTA public transportation in Philadelphia. They were working class people. And they sent me off to college. And I remember asking my mother, I said, what am I going to do with this $6,500? She said, well, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to pay off the rest of your tuition. And then you're going to put a portion of your money aside to purchase textbooks. Because again, to your point, textbooks were probably about $300, $400 a semester. And then she said, you'll have a little extra money to hang out in Georgetown and do all the things you want to do to have fun. Well, then when I got to college, every Friday for 4 years, I would go down to my post box and mailbox in my dorm, and there was a letter from this woman named Maddie Kelly, and so we called her Sister Kelly, and she was my Sunday school teacher, and she'd write these letters to me, and she'd say, we're all praying for you, we're cheering you on, congratulations, you can do it. And she would slip $20 in the card, and my parents would go to church and they would say, Sister Kelly, stop sending that boy money, he's all right. And she would say, no, I want to do it. Here was a woman who was on a fixed income, only had a 7th grade education, but believed in me to provide $20 every week with this encouraging note. Now that continued for 4 years. I'd go home over winter break and I'd come back and it'd be like 3 or 4 cards piled up. And that happened. And I tell that story because that literally got me through college. It wasn't just the $20, although that helped. It was the encouraging note, and it was the sense that there was a community back at home that was really cheering for me. And so I spend some time in the book talking about the importance of the Black church as this kind of conduit that really helped Black people, Black youngsters, be able to get to places like Georgetown, or in your case, University of Virginia, and so many others, where we would not have been able to navigate those spaces had we not had that praying grandmother or that uncle or that Sunday school teacher who really cared enough for us to invest in us.
Coming up, more with journalist Jamal Watson. He'll talk about some of the ways that we can approach the student debt crisis.
I think the other thing that we could do is really talk about financial literacy even at a young age, even before individuals go off to college.
We'll also hear from the interim chancellor of the Connecticut State Colleges and University System. He'll talk about threats to academic freedom.
It's placed our presidents, it's placed many of our leaders in a very tough position in terms of being true to our values, but also, do I take the risk of impacting the very funding that we are dependent on?
This is Disrupted. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking about the challenges that students face in navigating higher education. We're still joined by Jamal Watson, author of the new book, The Student Debt Crisis, America's Moral Urgency. Here's more of our conversation. Back in September, President Trump, the Trump administration, announced that it would cut funding to minority-serving institutions, or what we commonly call MSIs. Those are schools with large percentages of students of color, as you know, because you work at one of those institutions, being Trinity Washington University. Talk to us about the significance of MSIs, minority-serving institutions, in this story that you're telling, and how this kind of proposal, even if it's not carried out, how this kind of proposal can undermine that mission that you mentioned of a connection to community that empowers students and their families.
Yeah, so we know that minority-serving institutes serve students, many of whom are first generation, many of whom are low income. My institution, Trinity Washington, as you mentioned, is a predominantly Black institution and a Hispanic serving institution. The demographics of the institution shifted and changed from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, and now is more than 85% made up of students of color, largely women. And so I think it's really important for us to understand the ways in which these mean-spirited policies, right, and these mean-spirited attacks really do hurt young people who are trying to access education for the first time, who may not have parents who can help them understand the intricacies of the FAFSA, right, or who can't necessarily direct them in the ways, but have a supportive community in their faculty and their administrators to help guide them along. I think what we saw with the Trump administration, though, was this kind of attempt to say, well, we're going to cut MSIs, but we're also going to give some additional funding to historically Black colleges and universities. So here we have this game, right, where we're trying to pit groups against one another, when the reality is that HBCUs are also MSIs, right? I mean, and so you have this kind of foolishness that's taking place at the highest levels. And I think that, again, even outside of MSIs, you have these kind of requirements from the Trump administration asking colleges and universities to sign compacts and agreements that they're not going to do certain things. We've never seen this before in the landscape of higher education. And as a journalist and as someone who spends a lot of my time talking with college presidents, talking to administrators, talking to students, I'm deeply worried about the future of higher education in this country, particularly against its assaults and attacks on things like diversity, equity, inclusion, and now, of course, freedom of speech that's taking place on campus, which I think is very, very alarming. So I think MSIs are important. I think we need to support them. Of course, they're always doing more than what they have. They don't have the resources. And so I always tell people that even if you didn't go to an MSI, if you can find opportunities to mentor students from those institutions or give, your funds will and your support will go a long way.
When we think about MSIs, minority-serving institutions, HSIs, Hispanic-serving institutions, HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, your work also reminds us that this is a national challenge. This is not just about schools in southern states. This is not just about schools in quote unquote blue states. This is a national challenge to figure out, as schools are talking about the enrollment cliff of fewer people going to college or fewer people having families that are of a size that they will go. This is a way that schools, as you said, have made wonderful strides without the full resourcing that they need. Imagine what they could do with that investment. Jamal, you also in this book talk to everyday people who are affected by this crisis. Yes, you talk to college presidents and administrators, but you also talk to families, and people have said, this is what it meant for us. Was there a particular story or theme that stood out to you as you were writing this book and emphasizing the moral urgency of student debt crisis?
Yeah, there were so many, but one that comes to mind is the story of Tyleek McMillan, who grew up in Harrisburg, Virginia. And Tyleek thought that he would just go into the military. He didn't think that college was actually something that he could assess because, no one had raised any or saved any money for him, right, when he was growing up. His dad was incarcerated. His mother was struggling through cancer, but he got accepted into North Carolina A&T, and went to North Carolina A&T, received the ROTC scholarship, started his career, but then he started getting involved in activism, and he was basically told that, if you want to do that activism stuff, you basically need to do it on your, separately because you got all of these commitments as a ROTC recipient. And so basically he gave up his ROTC scholarship. And because he really felt that he wanted to be an activist. And that cost him quite a bit because he was uncertain about how he was going to be able to pay for his college education. Luckily, again, at HBCUs, you have, community that rallies around students. And so folks found ways to get him some additional funds and he was able to graduate. And now he's a sort of a civil rights leader doing his important work and advocating on this issue. But I loved his story because what it demonstrated to me was, again, the importance of staying true to what it is that you've been called to do. What is your assignment? And he was able to do that, and very, very proud of that young man.
We're proud of Tyleek's story of how he stayed true to his passion and to his calling. And we're also proud, Jamal, of this book and the work that you do every day to highlight why higher education or access is so important. But also, for some people, Jamal, they may hear this and think, this problem seems so big. It seems so intractable. What do you say to people who would then ask the question, well, what do we do about this crisis? So what would you say to them?
Well, a year ago, I would have had a different message, of course. As you all know, and I write about this in the book, is that, had we if we had a different administration, I think we would have been further along. And that's not to say that everything was perfect in what the Biden administration was proposing. I think it's important to be honest here and to point out that Biden was very reluctant to come to this student debt relief discussion, and he had to almost be pushed by the progressives in his party, like Elizabeth Warren and AOC and others, to move on this issue. But I think there are things that can be done. The first thing that can be done is for individuals, ordinary individuals, is to push Congress through calling or writing to double the Pell Grant, right? The Pell Grant, which is really servicing the most neediest in our society to be able to access education, is at about $7,300. That's not enough. And so what we need to do is double Pell for sure. And then I think the other thing, and I talk about this in this book, is that I would like to see much more cooperation between private and the public sector. So I was very happy to see that Robert Smith, the billionaire, he helped to clear the loans of those students at Morehouse College. I think we're seeing more of that. Mackenzie Scott has revolutionized the way in which we do philanthropy in this country. We haven't seen this kind of philanthropy since the Carnegies, Rockefellers. I mean, this is and it's helping the most vulnerable. It's helping our neediest institutions. And her investment in HBCUs has definitely changed the entire educational landscape, and we'll be talking about that for many, many decades. And she's done it all with, again, no real requirements, no strings attached. She just quietly making moves, and I think she has really shown us how what John Hope Franklin talks about when he mentioned good philanthropy can work, right? Because all philanthropy is not necessarily good philanthropy. And so I think that's another example. But I think the other thing that we could do is really talk about financial literacy even at a young age, even before individuals go off to college, right? We need to start helping students understand the importance of saving. What we're now encountering is this default crisis where students are defaulting on their loans. And as you know, once you default, it is very, very difficult for you to be able to buy a house, to be able to buy a car, to be able to take care of your family. All of those things that we just assume are givens in our society, they all go away. And so we need to help students, I would argue, as early as middle school, think about financial literacy.
I appreciate you for reminding us that we do have power and we do have agency, whether it is sending a note to a young person. That $20 could make all the difference, right? Just reminding students, we believe in you, there are people supporting you, or these bigger acts of philanthropy. There are everyday ways that people can say, yes, this is a crisis, but it does not have to be permanent if we commit to it. So thank you, Jamal, for reminding us of our power and also giving us ways to use it. Jamal Watson is a higher education journalist. He's Associate Dean of the School of Professional and Graduate Studies and Professor of Strategic Communication and Public Relations at Trinity Washington University. His new book is The Student Debt Crisis, America's Moral Urgency. Thank you, Jamal.
Thank you, Clyda. Good to be here.
Now that we've heard a bit about the national picture related to student debt, I wanted to focus on what's happening right here in Connecticut. John Maduko was appointed interim chancellor of the Connecticut State Colleges and University System in June. He joins us now to talk about many of the recent changes that we've seen in the world of higher education. Chancellor Maduko, it's great to have you back on the show.
Hey, good morning. Good to see you again.
Now, last time we had you on the show, you were then President Maduko. You now have this role as interim chancellor. For our listeners who may not be familiar, let us know, what is the role of being the chancellor?
So the chancellor of the Connecticut State Colleges and University System, known as CSCU, is appointed and really supervised by the Board of Regents. And in this role, the chancellor is responsible for the entire college and university system that consists of our 6 institutions. We have Central and Eastern and Southern and Western Connecticut State Universities, Charter Oak State College, and then obviously my previous role, Connecticut State Community College. And as a system, one of the largest in New England drivers of workforce development. And in this role, it's really to, one, empower and support our presidents in their respective institutions. It's two, to adhere to state and federal policy system-wide, engage with both the governor's office and the members of the General Assembly, and really advocate for both funding and support and a little bit of everything in between on behalf of the 100,000 learners, between 10 and 12,000 employees, institutions, and a litany of partners across the state.
Let's unpack that a little bit, because you said it so directly and matter-of-factly, but that is a very complex system and a very complex job, particularly now when we are seeing so many changes in higher education, questions about funding, about the access to higher education, and you are leading the system that really affects every single person in this state and many people across our region. You are also stepping into that role during a time when many people are scrutinizing higher education. What do you set as the key priorities for you in this role, given all of the possibilities, but also all of the challenges? What are the key priorities?
I mean, one, you have to be mission-driven. And the mission of CSCU is, one, to ensure that our students are learning and being developed, but is also to positively impact the economic development of the state of Connecticut, right? So for me, that's my North Star as our mission. I think two is being student-centered, right? I'm a servant leader, right? And I've made it clear to our board, to our 6 presidents, whenever I have an opportunity to meet with the respective Senate bodies of our institutions, that I serve the system does not serve me. So being mission-driven, student-centered, despite what's going on federally and even locally, keeps me grounded. And with that kind of grounds our leadership and our stakeholders in terms of what we have to do. Understandably, there is a lot going on at the federal level that has caused a lot of angst, hell, in many cases, fear. I hear the word fear often from our faculty, our staff, our students, and our partners. And this is where we have to double down on our values in terms of our inclusivity, our equity values, but also that we are essential, being that we serve 100,000 learners. But more importantly, 95% of our students are from the state of Connecticut. Over 80% of our students remain in Connecticut post-graduation to work and to live here. And that 90% of all residents are within 30 minutes of one of our locations. We are essential to the social, community, economic, and workforce development needs of Connecticut. And that's something we can hang our hat on, but also to work with state government, work with our municipality to say, leverage our system for the needs of the very people I know we all care about.
Talk to us a little more about those fears and concerns you're hearing. I think often when people talk about the crises in higher education, they focus on elite private institutions that don't serve the diversity of learners that this system does. What are some of those fears and concerns that you're hearing right here in Connecticut?
Yeah, I think one is perceived as the attack on higher education, a threat to the academic freedom and First Amendment rights historically bestowed on our faculty and many of the practitioners within the academy. And also, too, just, the values and programs and services that are centered around diversity that now, are being threatened. I think our faculty and staff and our students who rely, who support, who are a part of those functions fear that funding will be pulled, and we've seen that across the country in certain ways. I think, too, an encroachment in the academic freedom that our faculty leverage, but also respect within the learning environment. And I think, 3, the painting with broad strokes that somehow everyone in academia, everyone in higher education is indoctrinating our students, and that's farthest from the truth, right? Our faculty pride themselves in terms of, yes, stewards of the curriculum and the disciplines that are responsible for, but absolutely centered around the needs of our students and really expanding their minds to different thoughts and ideas to ensure that our students are well-rounded and civic-minded, upon graduation. So, a lot of that continues to swirl, and it's higher education has placed our presidents, has placed many of our leaders in a very tough position in terms of being true to our values, but also, do I take the risk of impacting the very funding that we are dependent on that supports instruction and wraparound services and student support services, what have you? So it's been just very challenging, not just for our institutions, but I believe institutions nationally.
One of the key pieces of the system here in Connecticut is the community college system, which, as you have mentioned before, you were on the show in 2022. At that time, you were the new president of Connecticut State, what we now know as Connecticut State Community College. I've always thought that the mission of a community college is so essential to understanding the health and the priority of an area of a state. And so that merger, there were a lot of questions when the merger was first introduced, but it seems, Chancellor Maduko, that the system is thriving in terms of increases in numbers. How would you say that merger has gone over these last few years?
Yeah, I would be disingenuous if I did not acknowledge that the merger was rough for the majority of those years in terms of just how it was handled. And I'm not relitigating, but it's important to acknowledge that our people, the faculty, the staff, and students of Connecticut State Community College went through a lot, right? And they are so resilient in terms of never dropping the ball as it related to the needs and successes of our students. I think in the last couple of years, there's been a lot of stability, still a lot of change. I want to give a shout out to Dr. Christina Arroyo, who's the interim president of Connecticut State Community College. And obviously this show takes place here at CT State Gateway. So another shout out to Dr. Xianghui Wang, who's the campus president here at Gateway. It's still a work in progress in terms of refining, processes and the continuity between the campuses. However, enrollment is up, and I think in partnership with the state government in terms of the PACT, Mary Henley debt-free tuition program that's really helped stabilize the community college's enrollment. But also, too, that it's one college, it's one application, it's one set of processes where, independent of location, the people of Connecticut can really leverage and benefit from the mission of our community college here in Connecticut, in that it's open enrollment and they never turn people away, and now in this role as interim chancellor, it's really exciting to see the collaboration between our state universities, Charter Oak and CT State, as we continue to improve transfer. There's a debt-free tuition program for our state universities that becomes effective in fall of 27. So our presidents are coming together to kind of put together some of the frameworks that is a seamless debt-free process and transfer from the community college to our four-year institutions to really be the epitome of the most affordable and accessible form of higher education here in the state of Connecticut.
Coming up, more with John Maduko, Chancellor of the Connecticut State Colleges and University System. He'll talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Often what has been painted in terms of DEI and equity is that it's given an unfair shot to individuals, or is demonizing other individuals. No, it's really identifying what are the gaps and what are our responsibility to close those gaps.
This is Disrupted. Stay with us. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're taking a look at the complex world of higher education. We're still joined by John Maduko, Interim Chancellor of the Connecticut State Colleges and University System. Here's more of our conversation. Our other guest on this episode is Dr. Jamal Watson, who's written this book about the student debt crisis, and he calls it a moral urgency in the United States. Community college system, public universities, public institutions serve a much more diverse group of learners than other institutions. How do you, as chancellor, think about that in the day-to-day work of, yes, we need to have quality, strong options, but we also need to think about the affordability and the access, because it is never just about that learner. It's also about their families, their communities that they're a part of. How does that factor into your work?
I see it every day. I think, one, we are an extremely diverse system of institutions in terms of the lived experiences and backgrounds of our students, right? Every corner, every background that you can think of is represented across our institutions. I think, two, not just here in Connecticut, but nationally, there is affordability challenges. There's a housing crisis. You're just seeing the pain and struggle of people, the worry and fear, right? You're seeing a slowing in our economy, right? I think recent college graduates are kind of struggling to get their first job, right? People are opting to stay at home if they have the opportunity to live with mom and dad or a family member. So we're seeing that. I know here in Connecticut, I will say this, speaking for myself, I recognize that there are two Connecticut's. One of the most wealthiest places in the world is Connecticut, but also some of the highest levels of poverty and insecurity you have here in the state. And knowing that our students are looking for that upward mobility, it crystallizes the importance of affordability. It crystallizes our advocacy with state government in terms of we have to do more. It crystallizes that wraparound services address both the visible but also invisible barriers that often our students go through, not just housing and childcare and transportation insecurity, but also we have a sizable percentage of our students that are first generation college students. I want to say it's 35% of our students are first generation. And because of that, they've never seen this thing called college before. So there's those imposter syndrome and just invisible fears and doubts that they have. And that means that we have to double down and even put more resources into those access points and wraparounds to ensure students know that we see them, They know that we believe in them. We value, they are worthy, they're smart enough. That's still a challenge. I think now where you have families and individuals choosing between, do I pay this set of bills or another set of bills, or do I forego going to college, getting workforce development training? That's real, and it's all connected. The one thing I've been sharing with our leadership team and those willing to listen is we have to look through the lens of the kitchen table. The kitchen table is, yes, a place where we break bread, where we celebrate, but the kitchen table is also places where people stress over the finances of either household, their livelihood. How am I going to make it to next month? If I live in a multi-generational household, mom and dad are getting older, I got to address their needs, but I have kids, I have my whole needs. What does retirement look like, et cetera? I think that's really important to put that in the forefront to say, yes, going to college and going to the universities is really important, but how does that translate ultimately when they're getting back there in our communities to hopefully sustain themselves and sustain the needs of our state?
What are the kinds of community partnerships that you think are essential to addressing those concerns, whether it is supporting students during their educational journey or creating the kinds of post-educational opportunities so that people understand this is a worthy investment of your time, your talent, and your treasure? What are the community partnerships that you think we should be prioritizing to enhance that success?
Simply put, all of them. Right. I know we have a wealth of phenomenal nonprofit organizations, from the community foundations that we have across the state to the United Ways, to nonprofits that address people of color and women and immigrants, what have you. It's all of them because they support subgroups of people that we find within our colleges and universities. I think, too, our focus needs to be how do we complement the very services that we offer across our campuses, from a food pantry to a counseling center to a veterans oasis. We have at least 10 childcare centers across our system to provide affordable and accessible childcare, because we recognize that there are childcare deserts, and we know that the governor's office and General Assembly has done tremendous work to create early childhood education funding. But 21% of our students are parents, right? So I think that's one. But what do the students do after school? What do the students do on the weekends and the holiday weekends during the summer? That's where the connectivity and partnership with our nonprofits come through. But also the nonprofits educate us on those dire needs that maybe we're not seeing through a higher ed lens. I think of Mendy Paka, who's the CEO of the Fairfield County Community Foundation, and her leadership and the foundation's leadership of convening civic and elected leaders and nonprofits in higher ed and municipal to address housing and food insecurity, and how do we ensure that people are employable but have those skills to thrive. So again, it takes a village, and we, right now we have a math issue in terms of the baby boomers, the largest generation in the history of our country. 10,000 baby boomers are retiring a day. People are living longer. I believe Connecticut falls within the top 10 in terms of the oldest state in the union. So therefore, more pressure on our social services. So what does that have to do? We have to get more people in the pipeline, but there are barriers making it difficult for people to get into the workforce and education pipeline. So to really answer your question, it takes every nonprofit external organization in partnership with our institutions to ensure that we're maximizing whatever resources are out there to help people, have it be traditional, non-traditional, adult, displaced, what have you. Our mindset is we have something for everyone.
You've mentioned a number of groups whose lived experiences often demands a different approach or a more attentive approach to understanding some of the barriers and challenges. You mentioned, for example, veterans and their experiences. You've mentioned women, other people who are first generation. How do you balance being attentive to those needs with what is, frankly, Chancellor Maduko, an attack on efforts toward equity and inclusion, and of making sure that people have a fair chance, not a special chance, but a fair chance? How do you balance those two?
I mean, the irony about working in higher education is, yes, we're charged with educating students, but we're also responsible for educating each other and educating, the external community. So I think one is really defining what equity is. My definition of equity is that there are inequities that exist in our society, right? And with those inequities, we have to disaggregate the data and really just identify what are the gaps. I think often what has been painted in terms of DEI inequity is that it's given an unfair shot to individuals, or is demonizing other individuals. No, it's really identifying what are the gaps and what are our responsibility to close those gaps in healthcare. And I have a healthcare background. When you know that African Americans have a higher rate of cardiovascular disease, there have to be greater reforms to African Americans as it pertains to educating them. When it comes to women's health in terms of osteoporosis and muscular sclerosis, right? There has to be more advocacy to women as it relates to those ailments. The same can be said in education. I've worked in states where the equity gap were white, rural males. And as an institution, we had a responsibility to create more wraparound services and reforms to address their needs, right, to get them to the institutional average. So that's really important. I think in terms of just the equity piece, we have a responsibility whenever there is a group or an individual that's falling behind to do everything in our power, right, to level the playing field for them. They still have to earn it. They still have to learn. Our faculty do not give grades. Our students earn the grades, right? But again, those gaps, and when we identify those gaps, it's a collective responsibility that we have. So I understand the question in terms of what to do about, these subgroups that find themselves in these gaps. It's our responsibility to educate people on the why, the rationale, the intentionality of what we're doing. We're not taking anything from everybody. We are not mad at people with privilege. We just want privilege for everyone.
You are appointed to this interim chancellor position for 1 year. What do you hope that students say about the system at the end of that year? What does a marker of success look like?
Yeah, I think for our students, our system of institutions are welcoming learning environments that regardless of background and lived experience, there's something for me to better myself, better my circumstance. I think to our employees, rebuilding the trust and the credibility that many of them had questions regarding the system and how we're doing things. I think in terms of state government, we want to be good partners with the governor's office and the General Assembly, and that we are responsible stewards of state and federal funding. And I think lastly, to the residents of Connecticut, that we are your system. We are your system of universities and colleges, and we are here for you, and we are geared to meet you where you are for the needs of your communities, for this economy, and where our state is headed.
John Maduko is interim chancellor of the Connecticut State Colleges and Universities System. Thank you, Chancellor.
Hey, Doc, I appreciate you. Thank you.
After we recorded this interview, Chancellor Maduko's appointment as interim chancellor was extended to June 2027. The Board of Regents for Connecticut continues its search for a permanent chancellor. Disrupted is produced by Kevin Chang Barnum, Robin Doyon Aiken, Erica McIntosh, and Meg Fitzgerald. You can listen to more than 250 episodes of Disrupted in our archive. You can find us wherever you get your podcast. Just search for Disrupted and Connecticut Public. And if you love an episode, please remember to leave us a comment. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. Thanks for listening.